Welcome to ACP. I'm your host, Alex Bollfrass, the head of strategy, technology, and arms control at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Berlin. On each episode, we welcome the world's leading experts in arms control to share their knowledge and assessments of the most critical issues. Whether you're new to the topic or need a refresher, I hope you will join us in our exploration of everything related to arms control. In this season, we offer primers on all the nuclear weapons arsenals currently existing in the world and their relationship to arms control. I hope it helps you better know a nuke.
China would like to start at the political level. How do we interact so we don't infringe on each other's core interests? You can't have just one-dimensional arms control without dealing with all the other variables.
In 2019, roughly speaking, before we start to see the fruits of the modernization emerge, China's nuclear stockpile was under 300 by the count of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Last year, when the Pentagon released its report on China's military power towards the end of the year, it was counting more than 600 warheads in China's stockpiles.
Mr. Xi appears to believe that a bigger Chinese nuclear arsenal could somehow give China a broader coercive leverage, could help soften America's overall approach towards China.
Today, we turn to the People's Republic of China, a country that has traditionally maintained a small nuclear arsenal, but is now rapidly expanding its forces. To help us understand China's nuclear history, strategy, and arms control posture, we have three leading experts on the country's nuclear program: Professor Fiona Cunningham, Dr Jingdong Yuan, and Dr Tong Zhao.
My name is Fiona Cunningham. I am an assistant professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania. I just completed a book called Under the Nuclear Shadow: China's Information Age Weapons in International Security, and that looks at the relationship between the nuclear and non-nuclear components of China's strategic deterrent in the post-Cold War era. So the first interest in a nuclear weapon of China's own emerges during some meetings among Chinese decision makers in 1952 during the Korean War. And they resolve that they're going to investigate the possibility of acquiring a nuclear weapon after that. China requested assistance from the Soviet Union for its pursuit of nuclear weapons, but its pursuit of nuclear energy by the Soviet Union was provided to some degree prior to the decision that China actually makes among its high-level decision makers in 1955 that they are going to pursue a nuclear weapon. One of, I think, the key reasons why China made the decision to go for its own bomb is because the year prior, it had discovered domestic uranium deposits within China that solved one of the issues with regards to fissile material. One of the other, I think, key points on China's decision timeline for acquiring nuclear weapons occurred in 1957, where China's leaders travel to Moscow and they're able to negotiate a strategic agreement in which the Soviets not just offer to provide assistance with some advanced equipment, including missiles, but also offer to provide China with a prototype nuclear weapon. That assistance never ends up materializing, as the Sino-Soviet split starts to emerge pretty quickly after that meeting in 1957, especially with the Second Taiwan Strait crisis in 1958, where Mao Zedong is getting increasingly agitated with what he sees as Soviet efforts to place China in a secondary position, exploit its territory, etc.
My name is Jingdong Yuan. I'm currently the director of China-Asia Security Program at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Before that, I was a tenured faculty member at the University of Sydney. And before Australia, I was at the Middlebury Institute of International Study. The Soviet Union basically pulled all its nuclear scientists from China. From that point on, China was more or less independently working on the project. Within a few years and ahead of the U.S. intelligence estimate, China would acquire a nuclear device. So China basically tests its first nuclear weapons in October 1964. The importance of nuclear weapons is such that even during the Cultural Revolution, where it was chaotic situation all over China, Many of the nuclear scientists or the people who work on nuclear weapons after nuclear tests, and then they move on to hydrogen bomb development. China tested the hydrogen bomb in 1967. So it's a very quick closing the gap between the normal nuclear weapons and the hydrogen nuclear. Only 3 years. So China was unique in that perspective because in terms of personnel, they had lots of people educated in the West. So they had the knowledge and they probably even participated in some other countries' missile or nuclear development.
The next step after testing is how China is actually going to then set up its military forces that are going to operate a deterrent. That occurs starting in the late 1960s when China's decision makers establish what's known then as the Second Artillery Corps, which is a missile force essentially that's going to operate China's nuclear weapons. That occurs in 1966, and China's leaders promulgate the first set of regulations for that Second Artillery Corps, laying out things like how strictly China's top political leaders are going to control the use of nuclear weapons by that force in 1967. In the period from 1966 to 76, China is embroiled in this period of internal chaos of the Cultural Revolution that involves a lot of sort of turnover within elite politics that severely stunts the development of China's nuclear forces for the first 10 years or so. There's constant turnover among the top leadership that makes it quite difficult for this force to get on with the task of actually deciding how it's going to do its job of delivering a nuclear weapon if China is attacked. And in the midst of this Cultural Revolution, of course, in 1969, China also has a border conflict with the Soviet Union that decisively changes where China sees the main threat to its security coming from. Prior to that point, it had really come from the United States. After that 1969 border conflict, China's threat perceptions decisively start to shift north, and the Soviet Union is perceived within China as potentially likely to use nuclear weapons in the course of that conflict. In the late 1970s, there are two principles that are given to China's missile forces, the Second Artillery, by the top leaders. What these two principles are about is implementing leadership views of what the appropriate role of nuclear weapons should be, which was to counter nuclear threats against China, or what Mao called nuclear blackmail, and to retaliate if China were threatened with a counterstrike. Those principles basically gave the Second Artillery a way in which it was going to protect its nuclear forces from a first strike and make sure that it could then generate the ability to attack an adversary with nuclear weapons and generate unacceptable damage in the event that China suffered a nuclear attack. The third kind of key principle that emerged at that point for China's nuclear operations was the idea of a lean and effective force, which is the force structure principle that appears to have survived up until relatively recently in its sort of enduring role within China's nuclear force structure principles is a little bit more of a question today.
My name is Tong Zhao. I'm a senior fellow at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I work for Carnegie's Peer Policy Program at Carnegie China. For quite a years, I've been working on nuclear policy through deterrence, arms control, non-proliferation. The first generation of Chinese leaders made a very important decision to keep China's nuclear arsenal small. And that decision had a long-lasting impact on China's overall nuclear policy thinking. At that time, the decision of maintaining a small nuclear arsenal was made partly to reduce international concern about China becoming another nuclear weapon state, and also partly because China faced very severe economic restraints. As leaders knew that China wouldn't have the resource to build a large nuclear arsenal, especially when the Soviet Union states had tens of thousands of nuclear warheads. There were no ways that China could compete with them. So China decided early on to be satisfied with much smaller nuclear arsenal. But that didn't mean China didn't have the interest in a larger and more capable nuclear force. In fact, China's military documents and military strategists discussions all indicate that when resources are available, China would be happy to have a more sophisticated, more advanced nuclear capability. At the beginning of the 1970s, China made another important achievement of launching its first satellite into orbit. Therefore, this overall strategic program in China was often called bomb, missile, and satellite. Those three major items represent the crown jewel of China's strategic capability at that. In the following years, China continued working on ballistic missiles with increasing range, starting with DF2 and DF3, DF4. All of those missiles at that time were primarily driven by an increasing threat perception towards the Soviet Union. The DF5, an intermediate range ballistic, was particularly useful to hold Soviet targets under threat. And even the DF5, China's first intercontinental ballistic missile, originally also played a very key role in deterring Soviet Union. Since 1980s, China advanced its intercontinental ballistic missile program in a very steady manner, but it's only in the mid-1990s China really achieved a credible capability to deliver their weapons to the U.S. homeland, which was achieved by the DF-5A, a modified version of the original DF-5 ICBM. In the second phase of China's nuclear weapon development, China really made important progress towards miniaturizing nuclear warheads much lighter than previous versions. That helped China achieve a MERV capability in the sense China could arm multiple warheads on top of one ballistic missile. And at this time, China's external security environment gradually improved, but China's economy has also picked up. So China had more resources to invest in the nuclear weapon program, which produced incremental progress. In a military parade in 1999, China showcased its DF-31 road mobile ICBM, which was eventually deployed in 2006. And afterwards, China continued upgrading this road mobile ICBM, new modifications to it. And today, China has developed its most advanced road mobile ICBM DF-41, which is of a longer range and has the capability of carrying multiple warheads. Even though China has traditionally relied mostly on land-based nuclear-capable missiles as a cornerstone of its nuclear deterrence, China has developed ambitions in sea-based nuclear deterrence capabilities and has also maintained, even though very limited capability of airborne nuclear systems. Its nuclear ballistic missile submarine was first deployed in the 1980s with the 092 Xia-class IISS. The technology was not very advanced. The submarine was too noisy to be survivable, so I didn't bother building of these submarine. Reportedly never entered operational combat control. But China managed to introduce increasingly better classes of nuclear submarines. Its second generation nuclear submarine, the 094 class, was deployed in the 2000s, and China right now has maintained about 6 94 class nuclear submarines, and is believed to have started building its third generation, the 096 class SSB. The airborne nuclear system, again, was developed initially because of China's lack of other alternative delivery options. But later on, as China's land-based missiles advanced, China really downgraded the importance of airborne capabilities to the point that it only existed in. But in recent years, China appeared to have officially embarked on a path to comprehensively develop nuclear triad capability. According to U.S. government assessment, China has already developed air-launched ballistic missile that is nuclear capable. Going forward, China is also in the process of building its next generation long-range stealth strategic bomber the A20 that is widely expected to be nuclear capable. In recent years, China entered a new stage of its nuclear modernization and has departed from many of its traditional policies, which emphasized a small nuclear arsenal and a modest nuclear operational posture. There are major changes happening right now to China's nuclear weapon program with a lot of uncertainties about its future direction. A major difference after President Xi Jinping came to power in 2012 was that he also felt a fundamental change in China's external security environment and China's overall geostrategic environment. He felt that because of China's growth and its capability to challenge Western and American domination in the international system, the US-led Western countries bound to adopt increasingly more hostile policy towards China across the board. So in anticipation of a worsening relationship with US-led Western countries, Mr. Xi appears to believe that a bigger Chinese nuclear arsenal could somehow give China a broader coercive leverage, could help soften America's overall approach towards China. And he made an explicit reference to Russia by praising Russia for making the right decision to maintain a powerful nuclear arsenal despite economic challenges faced by Russia after the Cold War. The current Chinese leadership apparently believes in some broader strategic value of nuclear weapons. That has been another very strong driver of the recent round of rather rapid, extensive nuclear build-out program.
There are a lot of different components to China's nuclear modernization. I like to break it up into 3 sections. What's the modernization actually entailing in terms of capabilities and operational changes? What is the goal and what is the reason? From my perspective, I think there are really 4 key attributes of the acceleration of China's nuclear modernization that starts to become visible in 2019 with reports from US intelligence officials that China is going to start rapidly increasing the size of its arsenal. The 4 key attributes are size, diversity, accuracy, and readiness. Starting with the size, I think this in many ways is the most dramatic change to China's nuclear arsenal that has made a lot of analysts like myself look at this as no longer being a gradual increase in China's nuclear capabilities, but a real step change and a change in approach to how China has thought about this problem. In 2019, roughly speaking, before we start to see the fruits of the modernization emerge, China's nuclear stockpile was under 300 by the count of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Last year, when the Pentagon released its report on China's military power towards the end of the year, it was counting more than 600 warheads in China's stockpiles. One of the key ways in which China has expanded its nuclear arsenal has been to return to silo basing of its nuclear forces. So with the discovery through open source research of China's 3 large silo fields of roughly 100, 120 silos each. And this is a significant, I think, change in how China has thought about basing of its nuclear weapons, where previously it had been moving away from these fixed nuclear launch sites for its ICBMs that are easy for an adversary to discover and potentially attack in advance, to putting its nuclear warheads on trucks, driving them around the Chinese hinterland. They're harder for an adversary to find. And so there are different ways of thinking about how you achieve survivability, one by easily discoverable mass, and the other by concealed but perhaps smaller numbers of nuclear warheads. The second key change in China's nuclear modernization or attribute is diversity. China now, for the first time, fields an operational triad of nuclear delivery systems, especially at the regional level, with ballistic missile submarines able to launch submarine-launched ballistic missiles tipped with nuclear weapons that the Pentagon has reported is now operational. China put its Air Force back in the nuclear business starting around the late 10s. We now have an H-6 bomber that's nuclear capable, and it's believed that it's going to carry an air-launched ballistic missile with a kind of regional range. And then obviously China also has its land-based missile force. This diversity is another kind of key attribute of the modernization. The third attribute is accuracy. China's newest ICBM, the DF-41, its newest IRBM, the DF-26, are much more accurate than its predecessors. And in particular, a lot has been made of the DF-26 IRBM, its dual-use capability, because it's one of China's first precision strike capabilities that has an explicitly nuclear role by Chinese reporting. Finally, is the readiness of the force. A portion of China's mobile missile force now actually patrols with nuclear warheads. Back in roughly 2015 was the cut point where you started to see this move towards patrols with warheads mated, but China had kept its warheads and its delivery systems held trucks that would drive these missiles around, so the warhead and the missile were kept separately. And so China has started to end the practice of really recessing the readiness of its nuclear forces, where it kept these two pieces apart, largely, I think, for reasons of keeping strict leadership control over decisions to alert and use its nuclear weapons, to focusing a lot more on what's going to improve the survivability of the force. Because if you can disrupt the mating process between the warhead and the missile, then you don't have to find the missile when it's driving around in the Chinese hinterland, which is a much more difficult task.
Tong Zhao takes us back into the early years of the Chinese nuclear program to understand a key element of its nuclear doctrine, its no first use policy.
Right after China's first nuclear explosive device in October 1964, the Chinese government officially declared its unconditional no first use policy, meaning that China would not be the first to use nuclear weapons anytime under any conditions. And China has maintained its no first use policy since then. China is very proud of its no first use policy and often claims itself to be the only country to have this type of nuclear policy. India, of course, has a different kind of no first use policy that includes some conditions or reservations. But China's no first use policy is unconditional. That doesn't mean there hasn't been internal debates in China about no first use. And this debate has happened more than once. But eventually, after each debate, China managed to reach the decision that no first use as a declaratory policy still best serves Chinese interest more than other potential alternatives. Foreign countries, especially China's security rivals, they don't often trust China's no first use policy. There are a number of reasons. One is, of course, as a declaratory policy, the policy can be changed in time. And as Putin has demonstrated during the Ukraine war, Russia indeed had modified its state policy on nuclear deterrent, had lowered the threshold of nuclear use. How to demonstrate the credibility of China's no first use has always been very challenging. And some of China's internal doctrinal writings also made this effort to demonstrate the credibility of this policy harder. One important example is a rather authoritative military document written by top experts, reviewed and supported by senior leaders of China's rocket force, which was called the Second Artillery at that time. A range of documents written since the mid-2000s revealed that at least within the China's missile force, they have a policy of threatening nuclear first use in a conventional war if certain conditions were met, including if China believes, for example, China's leadership or some critical infrastructure were about to be attacked by enemies' conventional weapons. China's military has the option to threaten nuclear use in order to deter non-nuclear strategic attack. And China's military has this term of lower the threshold of nuclear coercion in a time of crisis, just like what Putin has done to Russia's nuclear policy. The Chinese military also has this specific term to modify and to lower the threshold of nuclear coercion in order to maximize the threat perception, the fear in the minds of Chinese, deter their perceived aggression. And the military writings also a range of measures the military could take in cooperation with other China's state government agencies, including the propaganda organizations, to make the nuclear threat credible in order to, again, generate sufficient coercive leverage. Those military writings did indicate that, at least at the military level, options are prepared that may not be consistent with no first use policy. From China's own perspective, of course, the policy of threatening nuclear first use in a conventional war wouldn't necessarily violate China's no first use policy as long as China did not end up actually using nuclear weapons first.
Understand China's skepticism toward nuclear arms control. Here's Jingdong Yuan.
China's ways of arms control is closely linked to the larger political question. Because for China, there's no way you can have a very meticulously developed all these CBMs or arms control, force structure deployment, all of that, where you can continue to engage in a political kind of competition and very deteriorated political relationship. China would like to start at the political level. How do we interact so we don't infringe on each other's core interests? You can't have just one-dimensional arms control without dealing with all the other variables. And China in particular does not like the idea of arms control. You ensure there's no arms race, no crisis instability. You can manage both environments. That's why China does not like the concept of guardrail to do a lot of things which China considers to be detrimental to China's interests. For China, a good example would be suddenly you send a lot of high-ranking officials to Taiwan. So for China, their worries is that would gave Taiwanese officials the perception or misperception that they can rely on the U.S., so they will do things more radically from China's perspective. Because many people probably have not talked about it, is the China at this moment probably is not entertaining the idea of if there's a trigger event and then China, okay, this is a good excuse. Let's launch a massive attack on Taiwan because Taiwan's showing signs of independence. No, on the contrary, if they can manage and then to make it not a deliberate independence effort on the part of Taiwan, and therefore China does not have to use that as the final resort, the military, because they are not so sure, and then they know the cost. There are so many uncertainties. So they would rather kind of coerce or show of force rather than now thinking about this at the moment, or any insult or triggering event will lead, like I think the Russian dead hand parallel analogy. That's how Chinese arms control. And also they tend to go to the extreme to offer the position as take it or leave it. But if you take it, suddenly you have to go a complete elimination of all nuclear weapons. But then, or if we can't get there and then everything else, so we just continue.
Tong Zhao elaborates on Chinese skepticism toward arms control.
When it comes to arms control, there are three immediate obstacles in China. Firstly, China sees its own current nuclear buildup as contributing to nuclear stability because China's threat perception is very different from the Western countries, and China has convinced itself that it's just the Western countries who are adopting more hostile policy, who are introducing instability into the current national arms control regime, who are pursuing self-interest, hegemonic interests, who are trying to maintain their military primacy. So because of this unique perception, China thinks that it's time for China to counter that Western hostility by improving its own strategic capability, which could therefore contribute to greater strategic stability. From China's perspective, what it is doing right now regarding expanding nuclear weapons is totally stabilized. That's fundamentally contradictory with how many other countries view the nature and the implication of China's nuclear buildup program. So that's the first obstacle. Secondly, China doesn't appreciate American and Western concerns about China's nuclear buildup. In Washington, D.C., for example, there are strong concerns about huge negative implications of China's nuclear buildup for American security, for U.S. allies' security. The U.S. thinks that for the first time in history, it needs to address the threats from two nuclear peers, both Russia and China. They could coordinate the nuclear capability development and even nuclear use policy, or at least one of these two countries could engage in opportunistic aggression when the United States is already fighting the other enemy in a different part of the world. The U.S. doesn't know how to deal with this unprecedented threat. And some of China's capabilities, including the reported development of FOBs technology, fractional orbital bombardment system with long-range hypersonic glider warhead, those types of systems from American perspective could pose an unprecedented threat to U.S. leadership mind control hubs. It could be a very capable decapitation or counter and control type of weapon, leaving the United States with very little warning time. But China hasn't really appreciated these American concerns. All of these American concerns basically dismissed Beijing as excuses for the United States to develop its own nuclear capability to maintain America's long-standing nuclear hegemony. The two countries' threat perception are oceans apart. And lastly, I don't see a sense of concern in Beijing about the future implications of international response to China's current nuclear buildup. The U.S. is very committed right now to strengthen American military deterrence, including likely enhancement of American nuclear capability. It looks like the U.S., if the current trajectory is maintained, the U.S. is on path to fundamentally reverse its decades-long process of nuclear reduction, might start increasing its nuclear arsenal in ways that could threaten China's security in a very significant way. But somehow, all these consequences, all these likely countermeasures to be adopted by U.S. and other countries are not yet generating a response from China or even a severe concern. But therefore, we don't see yet a strong Chinese interest to engage in control talks in the future. As such, China's government recently has promoted the issue of no first use international and has even included a draft treaty on no first use. Its government document is submitted to PT meetings. There might be opportunities to start engaging China on nuclear issues by having an open-ended discussion on the issue of no first use. There are many loopholes and inconsistencies in China's no first use policy need to be discussed in a candid conversation. And the U.S. and its allies can also benefit by helping China better appreciate how its conventional military aggression in the Western Pacific, making U.S. allies very worried about U.S.-China bilateral no first use agreement emboldening China's conventional military aggression. To discuss China's proposal on no first use is another opportunity to remind China that it needs to provide security assurances to other countries, constrain its own military behavior, and reduce its own military threats to other countries in order to create the conditions for other countries to be more receptive to China's no first use proposal. That could be an opportunity for a two-way conversation on nuclear issues, potential arms control topics. And of course, US and China made a small progress recently after the two countries' leaders agreed to not have AI make nuclear use decisions as a general high-level principle. I think we could follow up this development by working on operational level guidances about how to ensure this high-level principle could be implemented and could be effective at the operational level.
Thank you for listening, and to our guests and the European Union's Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium for funding the series. Until next time, stay optimistic.